Welcome to part 3. I call this chapter Mountain Climbers. You'll see why. My mother's name was Matilda. Her maiden name was Matilda Adelaide Hinds. She was born in the state of New Hampshire in either West Swanzey or Keene. And these are the names of towns or cities in the United States state that is named New Hampshire. Well, I forget whether it was West Swanzey or Keene, but I recall that she spoke of them both as I was growing up. The family was apparently well enough to do and owned a lot of land and stuff. What the stuff may have been, I am not at present able to say, because since her demise, she's just not been very available to ask questions of. Of course, I wrote this several years back, and this is the first time I've actually read it since I wrote it. So, well, I guess if I have read it in recent history, I didn't really remember that part, and it just struck me as funny the way I had said that. Anyway, her side of the family came over from England and landed in Salem, Massachusetts in the mid-1600s. From that side of the family, I even had an ancestor that fought in the American Revolutionary War. I remember my mom had a book. I believe it was entitled The History of Chesterfield, that gave some of the story. I forget his name, but I remember that he was a captain, but that's all I recall. That book and the history that went with it were lost along the way in the wake of the many times I moved as an adult. But more about that later. My mom attempted to have me listed in the organization known as Sons of the American Revolution. But she said that since I was what was referred to as a bastard, that they refused to acknowledge me. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with the term bastard indicated that I was born out of wedlock. In other words, she wasn't married to the person who was my biological father. And certainly, I don't know what it's like these days, but back in those days, here in the United States, there was apparently a lot of prejudice about things like that. So when she looked into having me listed with that organization, Sons of the American Revolution, they had said no, because they didn't want anyone that was what they considered to be a bastard, which was me, since she wasn't married to the biological unit that, um, shared his seed to help create this person. So there you have it. Do you like the way I expressed that? um, let's see. And so here I go on to say, things are probably different these days, but I really no longer care. Oh, the bastard part, that's what I have written here. Perhaps I'm about to explain what I just explained. Well, maybe I should have read this to myself before I read it in front of the camera, but here we have it anyway. Well, my mom never did marry the fellow whose seed impregnated her. I think I said it better here. Maybe I should reserve commentary until I know what I have written here. And I, to the best of my conscious knowledge, never met the man. Although I did hear his voice on the phone once one evening, when I was maybe 3 or 4. I remember he said he would be coming by that night to see me. He didn't show up, though. I wonder why. I remember the event distinctly, not really, I think, because he was my father, since I didn't know what that meant, but because after the conversation with him, my mom vomited a peculiar shade of pea soup green liquid. My apologies if that was disturbing to anyone, but that's what I have written here. For many, many years after that, I suffered a very definite aversion to the color green. Not an easy thing to endure, since nature's proliferation of green in the area of my childhood was considerable. And that's that's true. I don't know if I have it written here, but one day when I was a teenager, I thought about it, because I had been like, just bothered by green ever since that event, and just plain didn't like the color green. And then one day, probably maybe like in my mid-teens, it occurred to me. It was like, wait a minute, to not like green, that's a pretty widespread dislike. So I decided to narrow it down to just that shade of green, which I think was a smart thing to do. Okay, so where are we? My mom said he was Spanish and lived in New York City, New York, after they parted. She said when she met him, he was a bicycle repair person in Springfield, Massachusetts. She said she didn't tell him she was pregnant. I guess he must have figured that out later, though, because she would send him occasional letters about me with pictures. And she said she thought he was getting them because they weren't sent back or anything. Just his voice on the phone one night when I was little. So I'm not able to relate any history from his side of the family tree. It didn't bother me when I was growing up. It seemed to bother other people. But I didn't understand that. When people would say something like, what does your father do? And I would reply that I didn't have one, they would usually say something like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't understand that at all. When I was old enough to have a better idea of what that meant, I realized that they just didn't understand what my experience was like. It wasn't like I ever consciously missed having a father, because I just never had one right from the start. So I couldn't feel the loss of something I never had. The only time I recall feeling uncomfortable about it was when one day in kindergarten, when the teacher had us make a drawing about what our father did for work. I didn't really know what to do, so I made something up. I drew a picture of my father climbing a mountain. I said he was a mountain climber and that he fell off and died, and that's why I didn't have one now. And that's the end of chapter 3. I'd like to thank you again for joining me in this continuing adventure of my autobiography in video form. Previously written up to a certain point, and of course I'm reading maybe in about 10 more chapters or so, I will run out of what I've already written. And so I will actually have to become actively involved in continuing the journey by way of writing. If you do enjoy what I've shared already, please let me know, because that just you're saying, hey, I enjoyed what you've already shared. Thank you for sharing parts of your life. That would be inspirational to me, and it would help me to be motivated to continue this project. So anyway, thank you for listening. You've been a great audience. Please remember to tip your waitress. See you next time.